David, talk to me about why the 80s was such a special decade. You know, you could have done something on the 70s, you could have done the 90s. Why the 80s?
Because the 80s still lives with us today. I mean, the 1980s is still basically the stories that we told ourselves back in the 80s. It's still the stories that we're telling ourselves today. And I think you can see that in our obsession with Ronald Reagan. You can see that in how we talk about the military as a country. You can see that in how we talk about race as a country. But the 1980s still basically defines who we are.
Those of us in the political world, whenever we talk about the current administration, we always juxtapose it to the 80s. Whenever we talk about the shrinking of the state or the military, we go back to Reagan. When we talk about welfare reform, we go back to Reagan. It all seems to come back to Reagan. It always seems to come back to the 1980s. Are we just being romantic because that's when we grew up, or is there something unique about the 1980s politically?
Well, there was a moment.
Well, I think there is something unique about the 80s politically. I mean, I think that Ronald Reagan was a transformative president, and I think that when we think about political eras, the 1980s is a distinct era. I mean, think about when you think about different political eras, right? You think about the 50s, you think about the 60s. The 60s kind of blends into the 70s. Then you think about the 80s. And I would say that the 80s, we're still in the era of the 80s. I mean, you can make the argument that 9/11 created a distinct era. But I would say, I think that we're still effectively living in the 1980s. And think about what Congress is debating right now with its budgets, right? The Pentagon, even though the Cold War is over, and the Soviets represented a much bigger threat than terrorists. I don't think anybody would dispute that. The Pentagon remains the biggest part of our entire budget, where it started to be in the 1980s. So we are still living in the 1980s. And of course, there's nostalgia for Ronald Reagan because, well, for a lot of reasons. I think that he remains a huge factor in our politics because Republicans are desperate for a leader. And here's the other thing. Ronald Reagan today, when you look at his policies, he looks like a moderate compared to most Republicans today. So his memory is basically benefits from the fact that I'm sure there are a lot of Democrats and independents out there who say, I wish we had Republicans like Ronald Reagan, as moderate and as compromising as Ronald Reagan.
What stood out for you when you think back on the 1980s?
Well, I was kind of amazed by the fact that there were these little tiny moments which had a really, really big impact. So one of my favorites, which we do on the first show on Sunday night, with Jane Fonda, who's in the China syndrome, wearing kind of crazy high-heeled platform shoes. She breaks her ankle. She can't figure out how to get fit for her next movie. She starts doing exercise and doing aerobics, and then she makes a video. At the point when she makes a video, she doesn't own a video herself, and she doesn't know a single other person who does own a video. And somehow out of that little ankle break on a movie set comes the world of home entertainment that we all live and breathe and consume every day of our lives now. The world of exercise. I think at the point when the 80s began, there was something like 12 gyms in Manhattan. Imagine 12. And look at what a normal part of life exercise is now. And also pornography. Pornography was like completely transformed by Jane Fonda's embrace of the video machine. It was an unintended consequence by her. But so that sense of very small things happened, and
I totally didn't see that coming. You know, I had music, I had microcomputers, even the gym, but the porn shift I didn't see coming.